to discuss the continuing concerns within the field of pottery studies, both scientifically and demographically, from the perspective of an early career researcher and a research postgraduate student, and to demonstrate how inclusion of this perspective may identify possible solutions for ongoing problems. Primarily, I'm going to be drawing from the extensive discussions about the state of our practice as it has regularly been assessed over the last 20 years in conjunction with demographic shifts we're experiencing and likely shortages of specialists. Areas of concern in regards to the practice of pottery studies is best summed up here by Jane Kimby in her review of current practices in Roman pottery analysis. And she stated that the immense potential value of pottery studies is not in dispute. What does appear to be an issue is the fact that many, although not all, pottery reports are continuing to fail to deliver. And it's this failure that is preventing new ways of extracting and interpreting information, and allowing for inter and intra-regional analysis. And the statement acknowledges the fantastic work and innate potential of Roman pottery studies, but it also does not avoid looking the problem in the eye. There are a multitude of unavoidable causes, such as lack of funding and the differences between academic and commercial, as just discussed. However, those issues result in a decreased capacity for more dynamic research. And I have another quote here summarizing the second issue of potential skills loss. And this is taken from the 2016-2017 survey of archaeological specialists conducted by Kenneth Atchison from Landward Research Limited for Historic England, Historic Environment Scotland, and CADU. In every area of specialist archaeological skills, there is and will continue to be a need for new entrants in order to maintain capability within the profession. The required replacement rate will be higher in areas where more specialists are intending to stop working in the near future. And so the need for increased recruitment is not a new issue. Many of those in the post-war generation have retired or approaching retirement, and the rate at which new specialists are entering the field is troubling based on the opinions of the surveyed specialists throughout the country. So first, I want to start with a little more detailed description and presentation of the data on these two main issues. There have been many reports and articles detailing the state of our field. However, the main points of contention seem to be echoed throughout. Current practice struggles with irregular use of national standards. Those same standards are not without comment and require updating. And methods are not consistently included in published reports. The STIFA Finds report by Cattermole reviewed specialist reports, including pottery, and identified that only 29.7% of specialist reports included the methods of their study, and only 12% included references to the standardized guidance documents that we are supposed to be using. Types of quantification, recording, and data archiving similarly suffer from inconsistencies. And there's a distinct difference in the treatment of fine wares versus coarse wares, reducing holistic analysis of an entire assemblage. But returning to demographics, here are some figures regarding the departure of archaeological specialists over the last 10 years by the Atchison surveys. The reports included data on specialties, however, outside of pottery studies, but it seems to be indicative of the overall trends felt by pottery studies and other archaeological specialties, and indeed most professions out in the world today dealing with the boomer generation, the baby boomers reaching a retirement age. 18% of those surveyed in 2011 said they plan to retire within 5 years. That statistic decreased in the most recent survey in 2017. However, the number of respondents on this question increased from 226 to 577. But it's also important to note that those surveyed in 2011 would likely have already retired by 2016 if their plans had not changed. Aggregating the retirement numbers from 2011 and 2016 means that 255 specialists plan to have retired by 2027. This estimated rate of replacement would need to be about 2.7% per year. However, more than half of respondents believe that there will be a continued decrease in number of specialists entering the field. Unfortunately, the assessment of recruiting to recover from the reduction in experienced specialists is not necessarily optimistic. One possible way to help preserve the knowledge held by those nearing retirement is through mentorship. However, the infrastructure and access related to providing and obtaining mentorship is not ideal. That SGRP50 report that I mentioned previously reported and highlighted the affiliation of specialists as a particular area of note in regards to mentoring access. So training for archaeologists interested in joining a branch of artifact specialism is hindered by the large proportion of sole traders or self-employed specialists. As of 2011, 58.4% of find specialists are independent from either commercial archaeology firms or academic institutions. This percentage decreased to 36.8% in 2016. However, it still indicates that potential specialists are less likely to have contact with established practitioners to gain the training and exposure needed to overcome current shortages. This correlates with the widely held opinion that from the Atchison report that nearly all agreed that access to mentoring from professionals in the field is difficult. The following statistics are taken from a 2016 Atchison study, and the results are presented here pertain to existing specialists and archaeologists who are interested in entering the specialism. Respondents were asked what qualifications a new practitioner should have. Only 7.3% of those surveyed believe that no degree or the national vocational qualification provided sufficient experience to enter the specialism. 92.3% believed that the minimum of an academic degree is required, with 54.4% expecting some sort of postgraduate degree. And that's a period of 3 to 11 years of formal education, depending on where you study, where students may have an interest in pottery studies, but due to various barriers may choose a different path. Specialists were also asked to rate the ease of getting initial entry-level training in a specialty area, and only 5.6 believed that there was limited to no difficulty, and the remaining 524 specialists believed that the process ranged from slightly to very difficult. Despite the consensus on mentoring being hard to obtain, it's vastly preferred by those surveyed. Nearly 80% of the respondents preferred additional professional mentoring over just academic experience and supervision. And this is compounded by the additional statistics that most expect a year or more of experience in the field prior to working as a specialist. And 32.9% identified even a larger period of time of 2 years or greater. And again, this is focused on those already functioning as archaeologists professionally and draws numbers from multiple specialty fields. However, the general trends identify that the primary and most important skills development occurs after obtaining the academic degrees, while at the same time being increasingly difficult to obtain. So let's assess the reality behind those opinions and the timeline of how people would come into contact with pottery studies. Most said that they expect a degree. So to meet this requirement, one would be expected to complete 3 or 4 years. If you're a liaison like me, to complete an undergraduate degree. This is presumably where the student is first exposed to pottery studies in a formal setting, and likely through comparative research rather than active excavation. But they may also encounter through field experience. Our hypothetical future specialists would then be expected to enter a graduate program by the majority of those surveyed. Using UK and US examples, that can range from a British master's program of 1 year to an American PhD, which normally lasts 7 years. Then the potential specialist would enter the workforce as an archaeologist and is expected to have, on average, 1 year of professional mentoring by an experienced specialist to gain the real world, in inverted commas, exposure. Only then would our example entrant meet expectations. A total of 5 to possibly 12 years of higher education before another year or more of professional mentoring before they can begin to work in the specialism per the expectations of those surveyed. And my question is whether we are missing opportunities to develop new specialists by not having a structured engagement with professionals as a result, instilling best practices earlier in those careers of early practitioners. And doing so could improve problems of meeting standards and skill shortage at the same time. So to generalize, we have a collection of issues impacting the effectiveness of pottery studies as a field. We acknowledge that records and reporting methods must continue to improve. We acknowledge that entering pottery studies is a difficult and lengthy process. We acknowledge that on average, those interested in specializing should have a university degree. And we also acknowledge that said degree is not necessarily enough to immediately enter the field, and that professional mentoring is expected. And it's here that I would add another acknowledgement to the list. We acknowledge that these issues may serve as a deterrent to potential specialists. And I'm not advocating for lower standards. Instead, I'm proposing expanding the discussion to include perspectives and experiences of students who are possibly entering the field, and to address connections between current practice and recruitment needs. All of the reports and assessments and the surveys referenced here are predicated on the perspective of these existing practitioners. The two issues of needing consistency and increasing recruitment are both forward-thinking. They focus on the immense potential, as Jane Timby called it, of future research without the clear address of future practitioners. Many of the publications discussing our need for improvement review the fact of inconsistency primarily to the closed audience of those already in the field. The proposed solutions rarely incorporate more than a statement on encouraging additional PhDs on pottery studies. What I believe this misses is the fact that the frustrations of working with legacy data and incomplete reports are not limited to practitioners, and potential specialists encounter these as students, which is before they likely have the opportunity to benefit from professional mentoring. Acknowledging that these two topics of current practice and diminishing practitioners may also function to some degree as a cause and effect, and may improve future recruitment. Linking these two topics provides an additional motivator to continue to strive for progress in the field, and includes a solution at the same time. Early training increases awareness of best practices, stimulates interest, and supports potential specialists. So I want to start here with a bit of an anecdotal story. One of my master's program course mates came up to me one day, and for context, he had selected an assignment looking into the Saxon shore forts and their pottery. And we had chatted, and he was very keen, and he had great instincts and very astute. But that day he leaned into the lab I was working in and looked like a man hunted. And all he said to begin with was, "I don't know how you do this. This is absolutely mental. I'm never doing this again." And he delved into those possibly problematic access reports, trying to make sense of it all. And the fire in his eyes had completely gone out. And of course, this is anecdotal, but it's one version of the same conversation I've been having with students for the last 5 years. And there's a specific sort of existential despair when an undergraduate student looks at you and says, "You do pottery? Yikes." So I want to talk about three examples today based on my experiences and those of other students I've encountered. And while these issues are also felt by established practitioners, the way in which students and early career specialists engage with them and must deal with them may be slightly different. So first, there is access, reliability, and repeatability of data used, reduced access to materials, and students' exposure to training and entering the field as a pottery specialist. I believe that the following examples, while here are personal, could help identify and support potential specialists earlier in their career. Students too encounter the frustrating process of attempting synthetic studies with incompatible data across sites. They comprehend the wealth of knowledge of practitioners, but may not have the network or ability to access it. And they understand that experience and training is an employer's expectation, but may not know how to achieve it. My personal experience is colored by the fact that I completed a postgraduate degree specializing in Roman pottery. In fact, short of the current geopolitical upheaval and global pandemic, there are a few things that could have stopped me. And that does not mean my issues were, the issues that I encountered were buried under a positive bias. They were readily apparent, often frustrating, and at times on a train line at one point from Carlisle to Newcastle had me contemplating the idyllic life of becoming a sheep farmer. No, instead of the difficulties I encountered made me more driven to identify the cause and possible solutions. And in actuality, as a graduate student, you have little choice but to problem solve and persevere. My personal research dealt with replicating a fabric analysis on Huntcliffe calcite graded ware conducted on assemblages in New York. The results from that study indicated a likely pattern of composition that separated earlier 4th century materials from possible 5th century production. And my aim was to identify whether that was reproducible using assemblages from the northern frontier zone along Hadrian's Wall. Testing included clipping and microscopic photography for analysis of fabric composition. And I experienced nearly all of the causes for concern that we have detailed, but also observed the negative reactions other students had to them. It's only been 5 years since the combined standard for pottery studies and archaeology was published. And we all know the length of time it takes to get something to publication. Reviewing the success of these measures and the adoption of other standards in addition is still very early. So the data that is encountered by students is likely, in all likelihood, the caliber which was addressed by Timby et al. This is further hampered by whether the data is published in complete nature. Data dissemination can be partial, absent, or no longer accessible based on the situation. And data was a recurring theme while completing my master's. Regional publications and reports regularly contain local or original but unpublished fabric series, making the identification of appropriate assemblages matching to the NRFRC a subjective exercise with room for error. There were also many times where references in text or interpretations included allusions to the pottery when no quantification or pottery report was provided. And at least one time, the data was appended in a CD using a format that was no longer supported by present-day machines. Additionally, there was the completely understandable yet unfortunate response rate of report authors. Everyone is busy, and I completely understand that. And I know a random question from a student won't necessarily be high priority, but inquiries to locate additional information by contacting the original specialists were largely unproductive. So obtaining the data was only the first hurdle. Insufficient disclosure methods is also a cause for concern by reducing the replication of hypotheses by others, such as subjective measures that are not clearly defined, or when recording methods are different based on the type of ware. And this, of course, reduces the effectiveness of future analysis. I repeatedly encountered fabric identifications with insufficient subjective descriptions. At times, the only thing differentiating one category from another was the difference between large inclusions and moderately sized ones, but it wasn't established what measurement was meant for either of those terms. And this was even more problematic in the case of color designations. We know that the perception of color is very subjective. And for instance, I actually have a condition called tetrachromacy where I see colors differently than 94% of people. So when the only information on the difference between subtypes of a fabric are orange-red versus orange-brown with no real way to match it to something concrete, I'm not going to have an easy time of making the distinction when I have a shirt in my hand. It's also important to mention that presentation of color is subject to medium and light source. So digital photography, glossy publication pages, or even lighting of a microscope can alter how a color appears in a photo. The next topic is accessing material. And money and time are usually precious commodities for everyone, but for a student, it could be the difference between selecting a pottery-related topic or not. Engaging with materials most likely requires access to things beyond the university's holdings. This means allotting time and funding to travel to museums or universities or other commercial firms that hold the pottery that you're trying to access. Then the priorities and resources of museums or municipal holdings may not coincide with the students. Diminishing resources of those entities may require reduced space for students' research, or records on excavated materials may not have been as thoroughly maintained as needed. My personal experience was that the museum holding a particularly promising assemblage limited student research to 1 to 3 days, and only when staffing is available to supervise. And that, coupled with the summer holidays coinciding with when thesis writing begins in my program, meant I had to exclude the assemblage from my study. And priorities were also a point of contention when locating the HUN-CG coursewares that I was working with. The records on hand at the museum versus the excavation reports didn't always match. And despite the lack of attention to these coursewares, because they are not a prime candidate for display, my requests for minimally destructive testing required further approvals and additional oversight. The SGRP member survey conducted in 2011 indicated that the most common scientific technique used by our members is thin sectioning, but even the less destructive alternative of clipping a fresh break and reducing the sheared weight by no more than a fraction of a gram was not necessarily appreciated by the museum's stance on preservation. So hopefully the examples provided thus far underscore how students experience the known frustrations of pottery studies, but I think it's important to frame this in the context of deterring potential recruits. Students, especially undergraduates and master's level, may only interact with pottery for a small period of time before they start exploring other different facets of archaeology. And if their experience is similar to my course mate that I mentioned earlier, they could easily end up in end any interest in exploring pottery further and take a different track in their career. They have more flexibility to avoid these frustrations by focusing on a different topic and selecting a different specialism. And access to mentorship, specialized experience, which have been identified as difficult for professional archaeologists, is likely more difficult to obtain for a student who's developing their own research rather than honing skills for an employer. So we arrived to my humble suggestion that I feel I have very little right to make, as this is the early career section. But I believe that mentoring can be a means to improve standardization and also evaluate and improve the skill shortage concerns that we have. If we revisit the timeline of potential specialists, there are many ways to expand the solutions to both of these problems if we start earlier. Encourage academic work in pottery earlier than the PhD phase. Improve our craft internally and establish mentoring with practitioners early will likely reduce students avoiding pottery based on the difficulties of dealing with data and access. And developing an outreach program and mentoring programs with universities to reach people earlier. That mentoring should continue and increase as they become working archaeologists and could increase the recruitment of new practitioners and sustaining levels as well as increasing levels going forward. And also ensuring well-trained specialists and their adherence to standards that are set out. We may be missing the opportunity to foster new specialists by focusing too heavily on those already functioning as archaeologists rather than providing outreach to students earlier in their career, whether that be through formal programs or ad hoc partnerships developed by our members. We can also stimulate more interest by acknowledging the fact that our frustrations with consistency and standardization may also be negatively impacting interest in our field at an earlier stage. There is a considerable amount of time before entering the workplace where a student can be deterred from selecting pottery studies. And this is well before a potential specialist will have access to professional mentoring through the workplace or other means. Developing a structured and active method of mentoring students and early career specialists will instill the ideal methods in recording that we strive for, and will also help reduce the impact of skills loss by passing on vital experience and knowledge to the next generation. And that, I am done. Thank you.